Because in the financial field, I was not a leader. I was a critic. As contrast to most people, let's say, who count in the financial sector, I was always a loner, and my role was that of a critic of the system, not a leader within the system. In fact, I pride myself on being the highest paid critic in the world.
But what lessons did you learn about how to succeed versus how one fails and the role of critic? Obviously, your criticism was intended to bring change.
No. My criticism had a philosophical foundation, right, which is the same as the foundation of an open society, the recognition, of our fallibility, and the fact that most concepts or most trends have a flaw. So you can recognize the trend, and then you can recognize the flaw within the trend. Then you are definitely ahead of the game. And that was really the key to my approach.
Yeah, go ahead, thanks.
If we think about the notion of reflexivity, for example, I would think that is an example of sort of conceptual leadership, I would think. I mean, the question is, of course, how do you actually transmit it to the economics discipline? Because certainly it's,
Yeah, I wasn't transmitting it, I was practicing it.
Right.
I wanted to transmit it as a philosophical concept, and then I happened on the financial market as a laboratory in which to test the idea. So I tested it, and then of course I had a sort of a final flourish as a fund manager, recording my test in the form of which then became part of a book, which was the first book, The Alchemy of Finance. You see, so that was in a way I would say that my final flourish as a fund manager, and in fact the challenge of recording it and using it as a demonstration of my theory kind of gave me the interest that contributed to the success of the experiment. Mm-hmm. So it came together there, and shortly after that I kind of phased out of the real fund management business.
But what was the next step after the fund management? I want to bring you over to the public sector.
The public thing.
Yeah.
So I mean, the Alchemy of Finance was an attempt to communicate a philosophy, and it was the theory of reflexivity, so that was that. I set up my foundation a little bit before that. I set it up in 1979, and I wrote the book in 84, 85. And then I was getting more and more involved in experimenting in what can one do with the foundation. But at that point, I'd made a deliberate choice not to put my ego into the foundation. And it was, at that time, my idea was that if a philanthropy is meant to serve a goal, then it should not serve the ego of the donor. So you've got to consciously divorce yourself from the work of the foundation.
How did you do that?
Pardon?
How did you do that?
By being faceless and anonymous in my activities, and basically I was helping dissidents who were on the line. So it was really their show, and they were the ones who were taking the risks, and I was really merely providing some material support. And my first, let's say, major effort that did not involve dissidents was in South Africa, where I went in 1980, 81, 82, and I set up scholarships, open society scholarships, so that was also a kind of a passive role. And I started negotiating with the Hungarian authorities about setting up a foundation in Hungary in 84. And in fact, we set up the foundation in Hungary in 84. But there again, you see, I was sort of behind the scenes. And then I extended my activities in China and Poland and other places. And since the changeover from communism was in various stages, publicity would have killed me in my activities, you see, because certain things that could be said in one country couldn't be said in another country. So keeping quiet was very, very important. And I remember when the first article appeared in one of the US News or whatever, it annoyed me because it blew my cover. It exposed me and the people whom I'm trying to help. Then sort of came the collapse of the Soviet system, and I became increasingly personally involved in Hungary, in Poland. Started traveling there, meeting with the leaders. When I set up the foundation in Poland, that was in 89, for instance. I had a meeting with Jaruzelski that kind of, I think, moved him a little bit to open up a discussion with Solidarity. But by that time, I knew the leaders of Solidarity. So, and then Russia, and then really, when I went to Russia in 87, actually, when Gorbachev called Sakharov and said, "Return to Moscow." I took that as a signal that, that he wasn't pushed out of Russia, but he was allowed to go back to Moscow. That's when I went to Russia, and that's when I really became very much engaged, and also that's when I found someone else to run my business, so I could disengage from my business and engage. So the changeover was between 87 and 89.
That's when you disengaged from your business.
Then I disengaged from my business. In fact, the man whom I found said to me that I really can't do it with you around here, and so I said, he basically was ready to quit, And I said to him, no, you stay and I quit. And so we then developed a very good working relationship where he became the champion and I was his trainer, or I was in his corner, but he was the one who was in the ring. And so that worked very well, and that was a wonderful partnership until quite recently. So that helped me because that gave me the platform, you see, of having a successful hedge fund. He continued the performance, and he had a very good performance. So that gave me the platform, which allowed me to grandstand as a man of finance with somebody else doing the work.
Yeah. I don't mean to pry, but did it also provide you with a continuing source of generated wealth?
Yeah, absolutely. So I used the income then to I was more involved with spending it than with making it.
Right. But you had accumulated wealth, but plus you had this new infusion of money coming through.
Right.
Which helped you a great deal. It gave you also gave you a financial platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Right,
so it was really a very fortunate sort of.
And what have you called yourself when you think of yourself since '89? What do you think of yourself as? A philanthropist?
Well, no, actually, philanthropist is a bit of a misnomer because. Well, I'm a stateless statesman. I think that's probably.
I found that phrase here. Yeah.
I think that I like that. This came from a prime minister of Macedonia, who at the time was a young man, and I think was well-meaning. He later became very corrupt, and like all the others. But he said, you are a stateless statesman because states have interests but no principles, and you have principles but no interests.
So play on the old Kissinger line.
Right. Yeah, right. So that hit home. So I accept that.
I understand now. Tell me, as you went down this path, what counsel do you have for other people out of the business community who want to work with governments or work with emerging leaders about how to be effective at this? People, you've been you've had this unique role, but what has worked best for you?
Well, I do think that my position is a bit unique, so I don't think it really quite applies to other businessmen. But I do also run into a lot of businessmen who genuinely want to make a contribution to society.
Right.
And I think there's a new breed, particularly connected with technology. I mean, the internet billionaires, if they are billionaires, if they manage to sell out in time or whatever, I think have a real contribution to make because they bring a sort of a creative, not just business approach, but a sort of creativity. In other words, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not, not a matter of haggling or it's a matter of creating. And they were rewarded for that in business, and are sort of ready to apply that. I do run into them.
But I want to go back to
what the
advice.
Works.
What works?
Well,
I know it's case by case.
It is really case by case. I mean, there's one man who somebody we invested some money with. He sold out the company, and then he set up an organization called educ.ar. He originally came from Argentina, and he had set up a foundation to provide curriculum on the internet instead of textbooks, and that's a viable business. In other words, you save on the textbook, that pays for the preparation of the curriculum and the I mean that's really a social invention. I guess it's not doing so well now because of Argentina. But for instance, I tried to move that into Russia, because it could. So I mean that's invention. I mean that's innovation, and so there is room for social entrepreneurship. I used to be very leery of it. I had the position that you really can't combine making money with giving money away, because you mess up both. They interfere with each other. Business is efficient because you have a single criterion, which is the bottom line, that tells you what the performance is. And the social entrepreneurship is a more difficult task, because you have different lines, because different people are affected differently, and you actually can't add it together, because you've got all kinds of unintended consequences, and you can't really measure one against the other, because what you do to one group of people cannot be offset what you do for others. So because of that, I used to be leery of it. I've changed my view. I think it's a much more difficult enterprise than private enterprise, but that's a good reason for it's a greater challenge, and therefore success should be more highly respected, because it was more difficult to achieve. And I think when you look at let's say microcredit, which was invented in Bangladesh, I think it's a great invention. So
is probably the #1 example of social entrepreneurship in the world.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Grameen Bank itself has run into some difficulties, like any business. As the entrepreneur ages or whatever, or the business becomes too big, you run into difficulties. So did Grameen Bank, but it is a great social invention. So this is, for instance, one very important area where entrepreneurs can make a contribution.
But now you've gone a different direction. You've made your money over here and taken the money
there
into a different
and
place.
I try to keep it entirely separate, because of the inherent conflicts. So mine was, you make it and you give it away, and that in a way is, if you like, this is old-fashioned philanthropy.
Yeah.
That's what Carnegie did, and that's what Gates is doing, and so on. So it's actually the old-fashioned stuff. And there is this more innovative thing where you actually invent social mechanisms that work for society, and are self-sustaining.
Right. Now, that's what I'd like to ask. Tell me about those.
Well, I don't know too much about them, because that's not what I do.
example.
And in fact, In fact, we made it a rule not to consider inventions. Actually, we had when we set up the foundation in Hungary, we advertised that inventions will not be considered because we were not set up for it. And the foundation of my kind is actually ill-suited for this kind of activity. We do get involved in it, and we usually fail.
I mean, you don't have inventions within the foundation.
No, but we do actually get involved. For instance, we were pioneers in internet. We started introducing internet in the countries where the foundations operated in 89, 90, when internet was, before internet really became as widespread as it is, before it became commercialized actually. And it's a funny thing because actually I missed the business aspect of it. I was an investor in a company called Bolt, Baranek and Newman here in Boston, which was the designer of ARPANET, which then became Internet. But then I didn't actually do very much on the commercial side, and I spent large amounts of money introducing it. And the introduction had sort of a business part of it, or business potential. So, for instance, we spent large amount of money in Romania in providing connectivity and then service and so on. And eventually we hived it off and sold it for peanuts. So as a business, it didn't flourish. If we had looked at it as a business, we could have, with that money, we could have really done something. Right. So it doesn't mix very well. The foundation mentality right. with the business mentality, right. And that's why an entrepreneur, let's say, who conceptually starts it as an enterprise can be more successful than a foundation that tries to create something that becomes self-sustaining.
Mm-hmm. I understand. So the the foundations you set up, so you set up one in Poland, you set up another one in Hungary,
right.
And they were locally based.
Right.
And they were run primarily by whom?
By the formula is a local board and a local executive director and local staff. In some countries where conditions are too, that's okay. Where corruption is too endemic, they need an external executive director for protection. Because they can't protect themselves, not so much against the state or the authorities, but against their friends. So you need a foreign presence in Central Asia, for instance. But in Russia also. But the idea is that it should be people in the country who share the objectives of open society, who then design the strategy and start the programs. And most of the successful programs were started by people in the foundations, and I didn't necessarily know about it. So it's a certain degree of autonomy. But the people in the foundations are not businessmen. They tend to be intellectuals, professors, publicists, and so on. So all they know is to give money away, but they don't know how to make money.
Yeah. How do you judge the success of your foundations? How do you know whether it's doing good work or not?
It's entirely intuitive. There is no criterion. We have, as we became bureaucratized, we have all kinds of evaluation things. I actually don't look at it that way, and it's really is an intuitive thing, because you can't. I don't think that. I mean, we have a method. I have a method of rating the foundations, and I have mission, impact, and efficiency as the three criteria, and they're not actually identical, because you may have a great sense of mission without having much impact, and you can be very efficient, or you can have a big impact without being efficient. So even conceptually, you've got more than one criterion by which to judge, and the reason for that is that in business, your objective is to be successful, whereas in this field of social justice or whatever, social concern, you have to fight losing battles, and losing battles is the winning strategy. The less successful you are, let's say, the less impact you make, or the more you need to do it in certain circumstances. If you are up against, let's say, an oppressive regime, standing up against that regime is very important, even though you end up in jail or lose your life or whatever. As long as you've got people willing to fight losing battles, freedom is not lost. So it's you don't have success as the criterion, because you really have to have.
I think it's interesting because the philosophy, the unifying philosophy, is the idea of the open society.
Yeah.
And I think the central challenge is how do you transmit that in an organization, because it's a decentralized organization. But clearly it's and you give them a lot of autonomy, and clearly it's crucial that everyone really, internalizes this mission, this idea, this philosophy of the open society, and then clearly your being visible plays an important, your leadership role plays an important role in spreading this message and this philosophy. But we'd be, of course, more interested also in the mechanisms. How do you actually do this? How do you get this to work?
Well, we are facing that issue. In other words, our success really consisted of people committed to a set of ideas, combined with a donor who gave them their head and supported them in what they were trying to do, not in what he was trying to do. So that was very important. And the supply of money And I think now where we are also, I guess, my persona. I mean, I do not underestimate, my personal charismatic role. Now, we have to adjust for the future. We are currently at this strategic decision point, because we have to prepare for less money, because I've stopped making money. My money-making days are over. So we now have a certain amount of money, but that's cannot sustain the present level of funding. So we have to cut the funding by half. It's a big task. So we have to do it with less money, and eventually we also have to think of, without me. Right? So I'm not sure whether anything will remain, but I'm willing to give it a try to reform the foundation, and we are now in the process of trying to implement that in the countries which are candidates for membership in the European Union, because their funding should phase out. So I'm cutting them off as of 2004. And they have to design a strategy to decide what should remain. And also another very important value of the network is that it's a network. In other words, that people connect. You see that we've got a foundation, but they interrelate with the other foundations. So the networking aspect is an important part. So how can one maintain that network when you cut my concept is to unbundle the activities of the foundation. So we have, from a network, I want to take it into a network of networks, so that the various activities that we support can form their own networks. So let's say we're working with the mentally retarded, let's say this, or human rights or whatever. They can have their own network. Women, we have a network women's program, so the women, that network can continue. And they would have to look for support from other sources than us. But we can contribute some, because we have got some money to contribute. But obviously they cannot rely on support from us alone. So you then have these network of networks to bring them, these networks, to bring them together in a network of networks. You need something like an association, an open society association. That is a membership association, so people belong to it. It's like a bit of an alumni organization, if you like. People who have been connected with the foundation support the goals of the foundation. And then you have at the center something like a think tank that is concerned with preserving, strengthening open society within the country, helping development of open societies in other countries, because that's an important element, and let's say be concerned with a global open society, that is the international institutions that you need. Whether this will happen without the the constant injection of money. It depends on the people. It may work in some countries, it may not work in other countries. The chances of success are not more than 50-50. But we've got to go there.
So you.
Right.
So your role as a leader is essentially then, on the one hand, being, I would say, a chief encouraging officer, so to speak, someone, the guardian of principles that inspires, and at the same time getting the right structures into place in a way. Getting the right structures into place, setting up the networks, recruiting the right type of people.
Yeah, it's a strategy. I mean, I would say that I am the strategist, but when it comes to the actual implementation, I've been known not to be the best.
On the implementation.
Well, even on the strategy. In other words, I'm not an organization man. I'm basically a loner, and I'm a thinker, but I'm not a leader of men. It's as such. And also, I'm definitely not an administrative genius. So how to structure it? You see, I never knew how to make an organization work. When I set up the foundation in Hungary, and I would go there from time to time and would decide that certain things would need to be done, I'd come back and it was done. And I was amazed. How could they do it? I don't know how they did it. They were self-starters.
Right.
See, that was the spirit, and that was the genius of the foundation. That people were motivated and they got it done.
But it sounds like you had to have a great deal of self-understanding. Self-understanding. You had to know who you were.
Yes.
You had to know your strengths and your weaknesses.
Yes. No, I mean, you see, I'm a very critical. I mean, I am best paid critic, right? So I should be able to apply that to my own activities. In fact, I had a partner in my business, and I used to say that where we both knew when other people when other people were doing something wrong. In other words, we both knew the flaws in the world, but I also knew the flaws in us, as opposed to him who thought that we were always right. So since my theory is that markets basically are always wrong, but most of the time they can validate their biases. I also know that most of the time I'm wrong. So I'm extremely critical person. That is my how should I say, my particular characteristic. And it is in fact the philosophy in which I failed to kind of get across, which is the inherent fallibility of our understanding, the fertile fallacies and so on, which make history. So that's my core. That's my.
Your core belief is the fallibility.
Of my own fallibility.
Your own fallibility and society's fallibility.
Yes.
And then an open society is one which then can correct.
Yes.
Because it has a feedback system, has a feedback mechanism.
Right.
Which tells people when things are going badly.
Right. And an open society is an imperfect society that holds itself open to improvement because it has a feedback mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
And you try to live your own life in the same way.
Yeah. Yes.
With a lot of feedback, internal feedback from within yourself.
Yes.
On the theory that you're fallible, you're most of wrong.
Yes.
Most of the time you're wrong.
Yeah.
And how do you know when to correct? Is that intuition?
Well, I think it's when there's a divergence between what you expect and what happens, right? Then you know that you're wrong.
Right.
So this approach is particularly useful in, let's say, in marketable securities, or because there you have a pretty immediate feedback. It's less valuable when it comes to venture capital, and even less valuable when it comes to politics, let's say. You know.
That's very interesting. Yeah. I want to come back to a couple things. Losing, you said, was often the right strategy, and that comes in a society in which you're in the minority, I assume, on an issue.
Yes. Yes.
Then, if you lose, it's okay to keep losing if you keep the issue alive, and gradually win people over on the moral argument, I would assume.
Right.
Or gradually you can win the argument.
Right.
If you keep alive. Is that what point you're
Well,
making?
the point is morality.
Right.
You see, business, or let's say markets, are amoral. Morality doesn't come into it. It's a matter of winning. Right? When it comes to morality, then you've got to believe in some values that take precedence over the immediate benefits of that concern you. So, you know, the Christians in the catacombs, right? By their standards, or you know, the fact that they were eaten by lions, and for that matter, the guys who flew the planes into the towers, from their perspective, they were winning. I mean, they were, you know, they were taking a stance. Okay, it's abhorrent to us. I mean, this is the difficulty, that when it comes to belief in right and wrong, you may be wrong, right? So you may be sacrificing your life for a false idea. You know, my particular version of it, which is based on recognizing that you may be wrong, can protect you against some of the excesses of that. But it is a serious problem about morality, that it, you know, you may be just plain wrong in what you believe in. But if you believe in it, then it has to take precedence over your narrow self-interest. And for whatever reason, I think we do have a need for that kind of belief, because, you know, we are mortal. You know, I mean, death has a lot to do with it, because the fact that you die, well, there's always an aspiration for something beyond death. I mean, that's why all religions are somehow focusing on life after death, or whatever. So there is a need for this kind of belief, and we as a society have managed to eliminate it, actually, and we got enough feedback from success that we can just pursue success. But that's a very how shall I say, breakable ground, because for one thing, if you're not successful, it kind of pulls the rug from under you. You see? So it's great as long as you are in the boom phase, but it's very hard to deal with the bust when it comes.
Or if you come in with your foundation into a society, let me go back to this proposition. You've argued that there are two great causes of poverty. One is bad location, and the other is bad government. You can't change the location frequently, but you can change the government. What have you found through your foundation work are the most effective ways to help move a country, encourage a country, stimulate a country to move from bad government to workable or good government to good leadership?
Well, one is educating an elite. Can be very effective in providing the ingredients of good government. In other words, people, let's say, in Eastern Europe who are educated in abroad, go back and then they can bring something. So, or in Mexico, let's say the changeover was basically by people educated in business schools. In Chile, it was the Chicago school, and that wasn't so good, because that's market fundamentalist. But so that's an important element, I think. Educating a new elite, it can be very powerful. And then when you look at the activities of some of the other old-fashioned foundations, like the Ford Foundation, when I went back to Hungary, some of the people that I worked with were people who had scholarships from the Ford Foundation in the 50s and had spent some time abroad. They might have been in the communist hierarchy, but nevertheless, that was a very good basis. So I think educating an elite it's a long, that's a generational thing, but that I think is very very important. We also, for instance, give a great priority to the problem of gypsies, Roma, in that part of the world, because it's the one minority that is really a real minority issue. Education, I think, will, a new leadership is already having some effect. Then
the education and the leadership, I didn't get that connection.
No, that's not. It goes away from your question, because you asked about government.
Right.
So coming back to government, then the empowering. Then you basically can agitate against a bad government, and then you can reinforce a good government. You can't really overturn bad government. I think that goes beyond the capacity of the foundation. But when you then have a change, a democratic change, the new government lacks capacity. And that is the worst aspect of it. And and because of that, it fails. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you look at what happened in practically every country where you had this break with the old regime, new government, people coming in who had no experience in government,
right.
Well-meaning, idealistic, academic, no administrative skills, etc. Messed it up. And usually the pendulum then swung back, and you had a return to reform socialists, or even not so reform socialists. Then they would fail, and then maybe you'd get a new. Adding capacity to the well-meaning, well-intentioned, reform-minded government
How do you
can
do
be
that?
very powerful.
How do you do that?
You do it partly by providing them with foreign experts who work for them, as distinct from foreign experts working for an international organization or for a donor. Because that enables them to negotiate with those institutions and protect the interests of the country against the interests of the institutional interests of the donors. That is a very, very important element.
You mean if you have a foreigner working for you as an expert, he can be a mediator or be helpful to you in
Let me
working with
give
the
you
IMF?
give you an example in Ukraine, which is not a success story, but when there was a change of government, I offered them brought in actually somebody called Anders Aslund, who then worked for the government negotiating with the IMF. And so within 6 weeks they had a program. See, otherwise it might not have happened. So that can be very, and I'm trying that also in Africa, but I'm doing it with UNDP, and that is not working so well for whatever reason, UNDP and so on. But that's not so successful.
With
But
Mark Malloch Brown.
Mark
Yeah,
Malloch Brown, yeah.
Because he's someone you've worked with before.
Yeah, he was sort of part of he was very much in my team. Then now he's at UNDP, so we try to work together. And we work very well, and we are doing some things, but then the bureaucracies don't mesh quite so well. We have, for instance, given fellowships to people returning from abroad who take a public position, public service. If they work in a ministry or in local government or whatever. In countries like, for instance, Albania or Romania.
You give them a fellowship to come study.
To come back.
Come back.
We give them fellowships to go out, maybe, or to go to the Central European University, but then you also have to give them a fellowship to come back because otherwise they wouldn't be properly paid.
Right.
So you have to give them, enable them to come back. I mean, it's not, we don't give them princely salaries, but sufficient for a graduate to attract him back if he's interested. That is also very successul. So you now have, several ministers in Albania, let's say, who came back that way. I think the foreign minister and so on. So that's another effective way of. This is now recognized, actually. For instance, the British are doing it. The British are quite good in foreign aid, and they are giving this kind of support. Establishing a judiciary, essential for an open society, but you have to pay them, and otherwise they have to take payment. So you have to have a.
They have to be corrupt.
Pardon?
Otherwise, they have to take money under the table.
Yeah, they have to. Be so, for instance, in Georgia, they did it with World Bank help, but the World Bank is not allowed to pay salaries. It's against their rules, and so they actually had a very successful judiciary reform. Where they had professional selection, testing for the position, and then a decent salary. And since aid is fungible, they could pay the salaries by getting paid for other things. But they couldn't maintain it. And so the whole thing is now eroding. And it's a very interesting situation, because there was a major effort at anti-corruption, corruption is atrocious. There was a major anti-corruption effort supported by the foundation, but also supported inside the government. You had the Minister of Justice, who was, I guess, a very good guy, and other people in the government, young people who had come back from abroad, partly, Soros scholars and so on. And it came very close to success in that it didn't make it, so they left the government now. They resigned from their posts. But they were really introducing reforms. But one of the problems that they faced is that the judicial system, which had been reformed, was crumbling because the salaries could not be, the judges were not being paid. So this kind of effort can be very, very successful. And then you can have joint ventures with the government, a reform-minded government, which is what we did, for instance, in Russia, where we would contribute money and they would contribute the franchise, let's say, of education. So we had new textbooks, competition for new textbooks, sponsored, and it was managed by a joint task force, which had the ministry represented and the foundation represented. So it's a much more intrusive way of providing assistance than what international institutions are willing to do.
What difference does it make what difference does the quality of the head of the government make for this effort?
It's night and day. I mean, if you've got it makes all the difference. But the good guys know that they don't have a bureaucracy on which they can rely. So, for instance, the people in the education in Russia, they were eager that this thing should happen outside the ministry, because if they did it with the ministry, it wouldn't get done. Or in Albania, let's say we had a program for building schools. They effectively built schools, and it was outside the ministry. Because the ministry, even though, let's say, you had a reform-minded minister, the bureaucracy, which is not paid, has to do its own thing. And so the idea that just because you got a new government, let's say in Ghana now, you've got a new government, it doesn't mean that they have got the mechanism for delivery. In other words, they don't have civil service.
Right. How do you help that individual who takes over the government of Ghana or takes over the Ministry of Education in Russia? Do you try to help that? You find somebody who's a good guy, reformer?
Look,
so what do you do?
I'm very basic, and good guy, bad guy. Good guy, you help. Bad guy, you don't help.
Yeah, what do you do to help him? What do you do to help him? What can be done to most help?
Well, first you meet his needs. In other words, what he wants to accomplish, and you help him do it. You may give him some ideas of what he may want to do, and he may internalize it because he didn't think of it, but he can see the merit of it. So actually, we have kind of penetrated some governments quite quite some extent. With, let's say, in Russia, they had a proposal to train people abroad, and it was a great idea. Yeltsin launched it, but they didn't know how to implement it. So we actually gave a fellowship to somebody in the government to work on that. And as a result, it was actually more useful than it would have been otherwise. So that's quite a bit of leverage. Now, you can't do that as a, well, you can do it maybe, but it's not, another government bureaucracy is not well designed, not well positioned to do it, because it is a matter of personal judgment and relationship also. There's a relationship of trust, and the bureaucrats can't develop that relationship because they don't have the ability to deliver. So,
What have you found to be effective in dealing with corruption? And how serious a problem is this for developing nations?
I have not yet found anything that really is effective in dealing with corruption. I mean, if we came closest to it in Georgia, where, extremely corrupt regime, a well-meaning president, Shevardnadze, but exhausted and also beholden and captured in some ways, and personally at risk. The main source of corruption in the interior, the power ministries, the interior ministry, and which he cannot afford to offend because he depends on them for his own security. So it was the most comprehensive, well-developed, implementable program, which failed. But it was really involving civil society and everything, but it failed.
This your program for open society.
What?
That was his Shevardnadze's program.
Well, this was the program that we worked out with
Your
them.
open society program.
And I went to Georgia, and he finally, the day I arrived, he signed the decree, but it wasn't implemented. So now the people who were doing it left the government. I guess they'll contest, and maybe in 2 years' time they'll be able to implement it. But that was, from my perspective, actually, where I was the most deeply involved, and where the foundation was most deeply involved. For instance, one of the board members became the head of the prison service, and so he was trying to break corruption inside prisons. And it was very interesting what he told me about it. He didn't succeed. So the answer is, so far, I mean, we're working on it, but we have not actually. I haven't seen any anti-corruption program that I could say really worked. Now, maybe in Hong Kong there was, that's I don't know about, but in my personal experience, we have not succeeded.
Do you think you were very far away from success, or with some adjustments, if you would try it again, it might?
No, it's alive. It's alive. It can, but I think it would require political. These guys have to actually. One of them has to become president. Mm-hmm. He has to run for president, and I think they'll do it. But they're not there.
How serious a problem do you think corruption is?
Tremendously serious, tremendously serious. I mean, the other is another case where I saw success, but it's not acknowledged. In Bulgaria, the prime minister actually made it a top priority to break some of the mafia type structures. And he described to me in detail how he did it. He did it in sugar and alcohol and natural gas. And I think he actually did it. Nevertheless, the government remained itself corrupt. There was corruption at lower levels. The Minister of Economics had to resign because of corruption. I personally believe he was not corrupt. In fact, I know he was not corrupt because he is working in an institute that I support, and if he had been corrupt, he wouldn't be working in an institute that I support. So I'm convinced he was not corrupt. He had to take responsibility for corruption in his department. So there is a country that has not shaken the image of corruption, and has probably also not broken the reality of corruption, yet considerable success was achieved in breaking certain elements of the mafia thing. And he described to me how he didn't use the judiciary system because it would leak. You couldn't rely on it. He had a task force that was kind of following the shipments and interdicting them on the ground. So I believe it was a successful program, and yet it didn't break corruption as such. It just had some particular points of success. So that's the story.
Well,
Okay.
We should let you go.
Yeah.
This is very good. We can continue this, but
Well, we can continue if you
I
find
just
it
had,
useful.
well, I just had a couple of questions about your own life, if I might, autobiographical questions. I'm curious. I know you don't call yourself a leader, but in fact, you really have become a statesman, perhaps without a state. About your own life, your own development. What moved you in the direction of wanting to bring social change, wanting to change things, and what was the sort of what were the?
But I
were
think
the-
that
did
was
you have a crucible in your life?
that came from an adolescent. That's an
Yeah.
adolescent dream.
Yeah.
bringing
Where did that
change.
come from?
Adolescent dream.
Right.
Maybe you had some. Maybe
We
you
all
had
did.
some.
We all
Yeah.
did.
So I would say that that was adolescent stuff, and then I got quite far away from it. And when I had been successful in making money, and I really reflected on what I care about, that's when I moved back to this area. So there was an in-between period of 30 years, let's say, or 25 years, when I was not at all engaged in doing good. At all. It was not.
But coming back to that dream, was it something that came out of your childhood in Budapest, or was it go on?
Childhood. My father. There's also a book. My father's memoirs are published now, and it's a very good read. So he comes alive in that. He was a formative figure in my life, and he shaped me, as fathers often do. So.
And the experience of your studying at LSE, how much influence did that have on you? So much is traced back to those days. and your discovery of Karl Popper.
Well, of course, Popper, and it wasn't just Popper. I mean,
Right.
The philosophy, this reflexivity, that of course came in student years, and even when I went into business, I kept on working on it. So I wrote a philosophical treatise called The Burden of Consciousness when I was working here in the States as a trader. So during the day I was, well, no, day and night I was trading, but on weekends I was writing. So I had that interest, a philosophical interest, but that still came from childhood.
Your father's influence.
No. That's more my mother's influence, because my father was not a philosopher. No, he had a certain practical. He was a pragmatic person with strong moral values, but with a very personalized translation of those moral values. In other words, he went through a formative experience in the Russian Revolution. He lived through the Russian Revolution in Siberia, and that, living in that chaos and turmoil, shaped him, which then prepared him mentally for the traumatic experience of the German occupation. And then the German occupation, when I was 14, was the formative experience in my life.
In what sense?
Well, because 14 years old, your life is in danger, so it's adventure. It's Raiders of the Lost Ark, good fighting against evil. My father being good, David and Goliath, outwitting so it's a beautiful fantasy life if you come out ahead, which we did. So that was that
was really your crucible.
Yeah, that was it. That was the formative experience, and that's where most of my ideas also come. You see, with this,
Sure.
with this, far from equilibrium, reversal, and so on. So it's.
Well, there's a clear line between your family facing Russian totalitarianism, facing German occupation, and then you're moving to an open society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Belief.
Yeah,
that's a clear line.
It's a clear line, and even my particular involvement in Russia.
Yes,
it has to do with the fact that I knew Russia from sort of more or less from my father's milk. In other words, he lived through it and so on.
Yeah.
So I have a certain affinity with Russians.
Yeah.
And so it's a personal thing. Okay. Yeah.
One last question.
Yeah.
Many young people today grow up in much more comfortable circumstances. They're not challenged in that same way. How do we encourage the next generation to have this kind of commitment to social good, to social change? You came through it, you had to come through it the hard way. Many people in the Second World War generation, the war was their defining experience.
Right.
And it changed forever their view of how one changes society, what the importance of protecting and building a civil society.
No, I had this discussion with my children. I said, "You unfortunate creatures, you have it too good," and they feel it in a way. Because they have their own problems, how to relate to their father, how to and so on. But it doesn't have this heroic quality when you are actually up against reality.
Right.
And it's very hard. And I don't know. I think that probably we can trust to history that things won't be that good. You see that there'll be opportunity for people to experience injustice and so on. And people do actually in their personal life. I mean, in my case it was sort of historical things, but an abusive father, for instance, it can be take Clinton. How was Clinton formed? There was a clear family situation.
Right.
Right. So I think, and people react to it in different ways. Some want to be different, and others want to emulate the. So, I don't think there is an answer. I don't think, and I think that unless people feel it, I don't think you can really inculcate it. But it's interesting, for instance, in England, which is a very comfortable society, there is or in Sweden, it is also very, there's a real interest in problems in other parts of the world, exactly because for some people prosperity can be very dull. Mm-hmm. So if you look at it, the Nordic countries have been the best in their engagement in development problems, and the British have been very receptive to dissidents and so on. So I don't think it's so bad to be prosperous. I wouldn't be worried too much about prosperity.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Very good.